I never thought a simple fountain in my backyard would start a war with the HOA. To me, it wasn't just a decoration. It was a piece of family history, something my grandfather had built by hand decades ago. When I bought the house, the fountain was run down and cracked, but I restored it carefully, keeping every stone in place. It became the centerpiece of my yard, a quiet place where my kids played. And I could sit after a long day listening to the sound of the water. It wasn't just a fountain, it was part of my family story, but the HOA didn't see it that way. One morning, I found a bright orange violation notice taped to my door. It said my fountain was an unapproved structure and had to be removed immediately. They claimed it violated community guidelines. I was stunned. I'd read through the HOA rules before, and there was nothing that said fountains weren't allowed. They had rules about sheds, fences, pools, and even lawn ornaments, but nothing about fountains. I knew right away they were overstepping. I called the HOA office to ask what rule I had supposedly broken. The woman on the phone was dismissive and told me it was aesthetic noncompliance. That phrase alone told me they had no real argument. They just didn't like how it looked, or maybe they didn't like me having something that stood out. Within a week, I got another letter, this time with a $200 fine attached. It threatened additional fines if I didn't remove the fountain. I felt angry, but also determined. I wasn't going to let them bully me into tearing down something that meant so much to me and my family. So, I started digging into the fountain's history. I remembered stories my grandfather told me that the fountain wasn't just a personal project. The stones used to build it came from an old estate in town, one that dated back over a century. That detail stuck in my mind, and I decided to find out if there was more to the story. I spent evenings at the local library, combing through old records. I even talked to a local historian who had studied the area's architecture. And sure enough, he recognized the fountain's design. He told me it matched a series of decorative fountains that had been part of the original town square. Back in the 1800s, my grandfather had salvaged pieces when the square was renovated decades ago and built one in his backyard. That meant my fountain wasn't just a family heirloom, was a piece of the town's history. With that information in hand, I knew I had a way to fight back. But the HOA wasn't slowing down. More fines came in, and letters threatened legal action. They even sent someone to my property to take pictures, as if they were building a case against me. Every step they took only made me more determined to prove them wrong. I decided to file an application with the city's historical registry to have the fountain officially recognized as a protected landmark. It was a long shot, but if it worked, the HOA wouldn't be able to touch it. In fact, they'd be forced to leave it alone by law. While I waited for the process to move forward, I kept the fountain running every day. It was my way of showing the HOA that I wasn't backing down. Would the city side with me, or would the HOA crush me under their rules and fines? At that point, I didn't know. But one thing was certain: I wasn't going to give up my fountain without a fight. The HOA didn't waste any time escalating their attacks. Within 2 weeks of my filing with the historical registry, I received a certified letter demanding immediate compliance and warning me that if I didn't remove the fountain, they'd hire contractors to do it themselves, then bill me for the demolition. The audacity made my blood boil. They weren't just trying to fine me anymore. They were threatening to physically destroy my property. I knew I had to act fast. I called the city's historical preservation office and explained the urgency. To my surprise, they were very interested. The historian I had spoken to earlier had already put in a good word about the fountain's origin, and the city was considering sending out an inspector. That was the lifeline I needed, but I also knew the HOA wasn't going to sit quietly while I fought back. Sure enough, one afternoon, I came home to find 2 HOA board members standing on my lawn with clipboards, pointing at my fountain and whispering. When they saw me, they didn't even hide their smugness. One of them, a man named Robert, who seemed to think he ran the entire neighborhood, said, "That thing is coming down, whether you like it or not." "It doesn't fit the aesthetic of this community," I told him flat out. "This fountain has been here longer than most of these houses. You don't get to erase history because you don't like how it looks," Robert sneered. "The board has made its decision. If you won't comply, you'll be facing thousands in fines and legal fees." I didn't even argue. Instead, I pulled out my phone and started recording. I asked him to repeat everything he just said, and suddenly his tone shifted. He knew he'd crossed into dangerous territory, threatening actions outside the HOA's actual authority. That was the first moment I saw fear in his eyes. Meanwhile, the historical registry process was moving along. An inspector scheduled a visit to examine the fountain. When the day came, I made sure to have everything ready: the restoration records, old photographs from my grandfather, and documentation from the town archives. The inspector took her time, running her hands over the stones, snapping photos, and even commenting on the craftsmanship. She admitted it was unusual to see such a piece still intact in a private residence. While this was happening, the HOA sent me yet another fine. This one claimed the fountain was causing a safety hazard. Their argument: that water might attract mosquitoes. I laughed out loud when I read it. My fountain had a filtration system that kept the water moving. It wasn't a stagnant pond. But it showed me just how desperate they were to find excuses. That week, things got more tense. A few neighbors stopped me while I was outside to say they liked the fountain and thought the HOA was being ridiculous. But others gave me dirty looks, clearly buying into the board's narrative that I was a troublemaker defying the rules. It was like a quiet civil war brewing on my street. Then, one evening, I got a letter slipped under my door. It wasn't from the HOA, it was anonymous. The note said, "Don't back down. They've been pulling this power play for years. You're the first person standing up to them. We're rooting for you." That single letter changed everything. I realized I wasn't fighting just for myself. The HOA had probably bullied other homeowners into submission, but now I had a chance to set a precedent. If I won, maybe it would give everyone else the courage to push back too. When the inspector's report finally came back, I was stunned. Not only did she confirm the fountain was authentic and historically significant, but she recommended it be fast-tracked for protection under the city's historical registry. That meant the fountain wasn't just mine anymore, it was considered part of the city's cultural heritage. The HOA's power over it was gone. But instead of backing down gracefully, the HOA doubled down. They called an emergency board meeting and sent a community-wide email accusing me of endangering the neighborhood's property values. They painted me as some reckless homeowner who had undermined the HOA's authority. I knew then that the battle was about to reach its peak. The HOA wasn't just mad about the fountain anymore. They were furious that I had beaten them at their own game. The HOA's smear campaign against me hit its peak in the weeks after the historical registry confirmed my fountain's protected status. They weren't satisfied with just losing, they wanted to make me the villain of the neighborhood. Flyers started showing up in mailboxes accusing me of being selfish and placing my personal vanity over the community. They claimed I had tied up HOA funds in legal battles, even though I was the one paying out of pocket to defend myself at first. I thought nobody would believe their nonsense. But one Saturday morning, while I was trimming my hedges, a neighbor I had known for years walked by and wouldn't even look me in the eye. Others who used to wave suddenly acted like I was invisible. The HOA's propaganda was working on some people, and I couldn't ignore the divide anymore. Still, the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface. The city's Historical Preservation Office officially sent the HOA a notice. The fountain was now recognized and protected under city ordinance. That should have been the end of it. Legally, the HOA had no power to touch it anymore. But instead of retreating, they became reckless. A week later, I came home from work and found two men in safety vests standing near the fountain with tools. They weren't city workers. They had been hired by the HOA to assess the structure. I confronted them immediately, demanding paperwork. Of course, they had nothing. When I pressed harder, they admitted the HOA board told them to begin dismantling it. I nearly lost it right there. If I had come home an hour later, they might have already started destroying a protected landmark. I called the police on the spot. When the officers arrived, the HOA president herself stormed over, acting outraged that I had involved law enforcement. She claimed the board had full authority and that the fountain was still a violation, regardless of the registry. The officer calmly asked her for the legal documentation backing her claim. She had none. What she did have, though, was a red face and a temper boiling over in front of half the neighborhood, who had gathered to watch the scene unfold. The officers escorted the workers off my property and gave the HOA president a stern warning. That should have humbled her, but instead it only seemed to ignite her fury. The very next day, the HOA fined me again, this time not for the fountain, but for excessive noise from water flow. That's right. They were now claiming the sound of trickling water from my fountain was disruptive to the peace of the neighborhood. I couldn't believe it. They were manufacturing complaints out of thin air, trying to wear me down. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. A local reporter had caught wind of the incident with the police and the fountain's historical designation. She reached out to me for an interview. At first, I hesitated. Didn't want more drama. But then, I thought about that anonymous letter from my neighbor telling me not to back down. If the HOA wanted to smear me publicly, maybe it was time to tell the real story. The reporter came by with a camera crew. I gave her the history of the fountain, the intimidation tactics, the false fines, and even the near-destruction incident. Within a week, the story aired on the evening news under the headline, HOA tries to demolish historic landmark in local neighborhood. That's when everything shifted. Neighbors who had been giving me the cold shoulder suddenly saw the bigger picture. They started asking questions. They realized the HOA had been lying to them. Even some who weren't particularly fond of me admitted the fountain gave the neighborhood character. And when people started publicly supporting me, the HOA's power grip weakened. But the board didn't back down quietly. They were embarrassed now, and they wanted revenge. At the next meeting, they announced new aesthetic guidelines that suspiciously targeted features on my property. They limited the height of landscaping, banned outdoor seating visible from the street, and even tried to regulate what types of lights people could put on their porches. It was obvious they weren't making rules for the community, they were making rules for me. That's when I decided enough was enough. If they were going to keep pushing, I was going to push harder. And I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore. I was going to expose everything they'd been doing to every homeowner in that community. The night after the HOA tried to roll out their ridiculous new aesthetic guidelines, I sat at my kitchen table with a stack of their letters spread out in front of me. Every fine, every notice, every vague threat they'd sent over the years, it was all there. And as I flipped through them, I started to notice a pattern. It wasn't just me they were targeting. They had a history of picking certain homeowners and hammering them with fines until they either complied or sold their homes. Then, magically, those homes would end up being bought by friends of the HOA board at a suspiciously low price. I'd heard rumors before, but now I had paperwork that painted a pretty convincing picture. That was when I realized this wasn't just about my fountain anymore. This was about an HOA board that had turned corruption into a business model. I decided to dig deeper. I started reaching out quietly to neighbors I trusted, asking if they'd ever had issues with the HOA. At first, most of them were hesitant. They didn't want to be seen as troublemakers. But once I shared my own experiences and mentioned the police incident, they opened up. One neighbor told me about how the HOA had fined her for excessive weeds when her lawn was perfectly mowed, only to later find out the president's brother-in-law bought her house after she sold in frustration. Another mentioned being threatened over having improper shutters. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. It was a pattern of targeted harassment and backdoor deals. The more I learned, the angrier I got. But instead of just stewing over it, I started organizing. I printed flyers inviting neighbors to a private meeting at my house. No HOA officials allowed. I wasn't sure how many would show up, but when the night came, my living room was packed. People stood along the walls. Others sat cross-legged on the floor. The frustration was palpable. I laid everything out: the historical designation, the smear campaign, the near demolition, the news coverage, and now the shady property takeovers. By the time I was done, the room was buzzing with outrage. Some neighbors who had once sided with the HOA looked ashamed. Others were ready to fight back. That night was the turning point. We formed a coalition, a group of homeowners determined to hold the HOA accountable. We started pooling evidence, documenting fines, photographing violations that the board ignored when it suited them, and even pulling property sale records. What we found was jaw-dropping over the last 5 years. More than a dozen homes had been foreclosed on or sold under duress after a storm of HOA harassment, and nearly every single one ended up in the hands of board members, friends, family, or business partners. The fountain wasn't their first target's hit, was just their most public one. The question became, what do we do with this information? Some wanted to march into the next HOA meeting and blow it all up right there. But others, myself included, thought we needed a bigger stage. The HOA had proven they didn't care about rules or shame. We needed oversight from outside, so we decided to take it to the City Council and the County Housing Authority. We compiled everything into a dossier: the letters, the police reports, the property records, the testimonies from neighbors. It was enough to paint a damning picture. When the day came, I stood before the council with a group of my neighbors behind me. I wasn't a public speaker by any means, but the anger and the truth gave me confidence. I laid out everything: the harassment, the illegal fines, the abuse of power. By the end, even some of the council members looked visibly disgusted. The Housing Authority agreed to open an investigation. Word: that investigation spread fast. And suddenly the HOA board found themselves on the defensive. Their once smug attitudes at meetings turned into frantic attempts to justify themselves. They even tried to spin the investigation as political persecution, but nobody was buying it anymore. Too many neighbors had seen the evidence with their own eyes, and through it all, my fountain stood at the center of the storm, no longer just a piece of stone and water, but a symbol of resistance. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted the board not just investigated, but removed. And the only way to do that was through a recall vote. The weeks following the city council meeting were some of the most tense I had ever experienced. The HOA board was rattled, and you could feel the cracks beginning to show. Their once meticulously polished newsletters turned into rambling defenses, filled with half-truths and thinly veiled threats. They insisted that the so-called evidence was being taken out of context. But no one was buying it anymore. Meanwhile, the Housing Authority wasted no time. Investigators showed up in our neighborhood with clipboards, cameras, and a stack of questions. They went door to door, interviewing homeowners who had quietly suffered under the HOA for years. Every new testimony added weight to the case. One night, after the investigators had spent the day gathering documents from the HOA office, I got a call from one of my neighbors. "They're panicking," she said. I overheard two board members arguing in the parking lot. They know it's over. That was the moment I knew we had them cornered. We decided to push for the recall vote. The process wasn't easy. It required signatures from a large percentage of homeowners, and the board did everything they could to stop us. They spread rumors, they tried to intimidate people, and they even sent out a flyer claiming that if the board was removed, property values would plummet. But the truth was on our side. We knocked on doors, shared evidence, and reminded our neighbors of every petty fine, every unfair threat, every moment they'd felt powerless. Slowly but surely, the signatures piled up. When the day of the recall vote finally arrived, the community center was packed. You could feel the electricity in the air. The board members sat stiffly at the front table, trying to look confident. But their faces betrayed the fear underneath. The vote was counted, and the result was undeniable. Overwhelmingly, the community had spoken. The board was out. The room erupted in cheers. Some neighbors even cried. Years of frustration had finally boiled over into triumph. But the fallout didn't stop there. The Housing Authority's investigation led to even more discoveries: improper financial dealings, unreported conflicts of interest, and misuse of HOA funds. Several board members were forced to resign in disgrace, and a couple even faced legal action and my fountain, the very thing that had sparked this entire battle. Not only was it safe, but the city went a step further. They installed a plaque right beside it, designating it as a protected historical landmark. Now, every time someone walked past it, they'd see the story etched in bronze. A community that stood up against corruption, and life in the neighborhood changed after that. Meetings became more transparent, rules were applied fairly, and homeowners finally had a voice again. The oppressive weight of the old board was gone, replaced with something we hadn't felt in a long time: trust. And every time I sat by that fountain, listening to the water flow, I was reminded of a simple truth. Sometimes the smallest battles, the ones fought over a fountain, a garden, or even a recycling bin, can spark the biggest changes. So, the next time someone tells you that you can't make a difference, or that fighting back isn't worth it, remember this story. A single fountain, nearly destroyed by greed and arrogance, ended up exposing corruption, uniting a community, and protecting history. Stand your ground, protect what matters to you, and never underestimate the power of one voice. Because that one voice might just be the spark that changes everything.